I love how Callus specifically calls it your empire, Governor. And she also mentions a band of failures who don't stand a chance. I'll be covering that later, because I got a few... I want to talk about the episode, and then I got two big points after the episode's done to talk about. I do think it's funny they threaten her with the wolf instead of Thrawn. You'd think Thrawn would be plenty threatening, but whatever. So, Melch is awesome, and a great distraction. Why do they shoot their own window? They see the Ugnaught, they're like, die, our own window. Apparently they have no brains? I don't know. And then they bring back Protocol 13, and I realized something in this episode. I hate Ruch. Ruch, whatever that you pronounce his stupid name. Like, if you think about it, he has no personality at all. He's evil, and he's loyal to Thrawn, and that's basically it. I wish I could have seen him be slowly electrified to death. I know that sounds horrible, but honestly, screw him. I love the bit where Ryder's like, do you always question the authority of a superior officer? So, most of the early part of the episode I don't have much to say about, till Thrawn goes right overhead and is willing to fire on civilians. I find that a little surprising. Only a little bit. Because Thrawn... I think it's mostly just because Thrawn recognizes how much he has lost, that he's willing to go that far. Notice that when he's actually in charge, or actually on top, he doesn't resort to such tactics. I only point that out because something that was never addressed in the show is that he didn't actually cause that butchery back on whatever the planet was. That was Price. She did that, and he got the credit for it, which helped get him promoted. And, from what I understand, he hated that, and hated her as a consequence. So, Ezra surrenders, and of course he has that wonderful moment, I'm trusting you. You're the only one I can trust, Sabine. We'll get back to that. So Thrawn is there, in his room, and he discusses some stuff with Ezra, which is actually a nice little character moment. Quick side, do you think those are Zalamiri on the background, or Vornskers? It's a reference either way. I mean, he even mentions what I would normally call Palaeon, although he pronounces it Palion. I wrote down a guide there to help me pronounce it. Palion. I'm going to have to get used to that. A deliberate reference, from what I understand, to try and leave the door open there. A lot of doors were deliberately left open by this show, and I hope at least a few of those are followed through on, but I'm getting ahead of myself. You chose to be a Jedi, he says. You follow a long history written by Jedi where they choose what they believe to be morally correct instead of what is strategically sound. This is part of that debate I mentioned earlier, the debate that Saw Gerrera brought up, one of the other themes of the work. One of the smaller themes, because it only came up a few times, but it did come up here and there. It came up with the Mandalorians, it came up with Saw, and it came up with Thrawn. Who deserves what is irrelevant, he says. What matters is who has power. That's an interesting mentality, and in fact, if anything, well, it reminds me very much of a Chiss philosophy. It helps to also emphasize why Thrawn is not a neutral, leaning towards evil character. He is an evil, leaning towards neutral character, at least this Thrawn. And as I've said before, I do think that is a bit of an unfortunate thing. But nevertheless, you okay. Meanwhile, we have a very Star Wars Act 2 going on. We have a big battle amongst all the people, and then we've got a very personal confrontation going on in the distance. A lot of Star Wars stuff, especially the films, have followed this formula, and it's a good formula. That's why it works so well. I'm not complaining or anything. So, then Palpatine shows up and really gets into Ezra's face. And what's interesting, I feel like they spent a lot of time writing this section, because Palpatine's dialogue is fascinating. He's incredibly insidious, which, yes, I choose that word on purpose. He doesn't deny the accusations put towards him. He doesn't lie about things. He just bounces any argument back in a direction that leads to his core point. That this is something you can have if you want it. That you can change history if you want it. That you could have that future that you deserve. So few people have the right, the choice to live the lives they want to. It's a fascinating argument, and it really is insidious. He doesn't deny that he's evil. He doesn't try to portray himself as good, other than the holographic appearance, of course, which is a nice touch. All he does is try to consistently redirect all of Ezra's attention towards the object of his desire. That's all he does. It's just fascinating. Sorry, I hate to gush about it, but it's some good writing. At least I think so. There's a nice bit where Ezra says, "What about my friends?" Palpatine doesn't even answer the question at all. He says, "If you open the gateway, you shall save your parents." Now that really does answer him. What Palpatine is offering is for Ezra to change history. And Ezra, thankfully, has already learned that lesson. Just 2 episodes ago, he probably would have walked through that doorway. And, well, that would have been the end for everything. Because the whole point is if he opens that gateway, Palpatine can get in. And that's the end. As I described back in World Between Worlds, that's a nightmare scenario. A galaxy in which Palpatine can access any major point in history and do whatever he wants to it? That's horrifying. Note he doesn't mention that at all, by the way. Palpatine never admits or even hints at what he actually wants out of this. All he does is tempt Ezra with what he wants. Love that section. So, I wonder how... There's 2 questions, and I'm curious of your thoughts on this as well. Number 1, do you think that actually was Ezra's parents back in the past, who actually saw their son? I think so. I think they got a glimpse. And to be perfectly blunt, and this is me kind of leaning towards, type 1 time travel, I love the idea that that is part of what gave them courage to do what they ended up doing, both times. To be the ones who spoke out, and to be the ones who broke out. That's just my take on that. But I'm curious of yours, as always. The other question is, I wonder how tempted Ezra really was. That had to have been phenomenally tempting. I am ashamed to admit that I know what that temptation would feel like. I don't know if I could say no to that. I'm not sure. I mean, I can't be tempted with that. This isn't magic reality. This is reality, where everything is awful and terrible. But if something was capable of offering me something that good, I don't know if I could say no. Side note. So then the Royal Guard come out, and they hold him up with these Force tractor sticks. What the hell are they using? Why hasn't it ever been seen before or since? Also, hang on. I can just picture it. Someone's going to pop in the comic and be like, it actually showed up in such and such. I have never seen it before or since. So there's my proviso there. But then the stormtroopers come in and start shooting at him. And missing. I know I said I wouldn't comment on it unless it was particularly egregious. This is stormtroopers missing a stationary target that's like 10 feet away. That's pathetic. Anyways, so, I really I'm sorry, I had to scroll down my notes. I actually have a large amount of notes for today's episode. I feel bad for poor Gregor. But at the same time, for a clone to fight in something we choose to believe in, that is a true treat for someone like a clone, from one of the Clone Wars clones. So that's when the Paleon, reference shows up. I've been calling him Palaeon since like the 90s. And the Purrgil just rack the ISDs. Do the ISDs even have armor? I know, Pringles. And there goes Ezra, and there goes Thrawn. If you didn't know, would you say they survived? Now, the door was left a little bit open in this Star Wars, but I have to admit I would presume both survived, based on what I've seen here. And I'll go ahead and just say, yeah, we know they survived. There have been multiple interviews since then confirming that, at least in the mind of the writers, they survived. To my knowledge, nothing has been done with that yet, but that door was left very deliberately open so that Ezra's still out there, and that Thrawn is still out there, and that's significant going forward. I've been thinking about this recently. Forgive me for segueing for just a second. In the AU, a huge body of works exist to flesh out the time between the Clone Wars and the end of Return of the Jedi. There's a lot here. Very, very few spaces in between here. But I started thinking about it. The AU hasn't really covered post-Return all that much, has it? I mean, there's been a few things, usually references or inferences or things that are specifically attached to the sequel trilogy. But for the most part, it's been like a big blank screen, and that's like 20, I want to say, 20-year gap, something like that in there. It's almost strange that direction. But at the same time, that also makes perfect sense if you think about it. Because most of the narrative has been acting roughly sequentially. And we've got alliances and, I can't think of the name of the other show. There's Mandalorian is the other show, which are going to now help establish some of the gap in there. So I guess I can see it. It's just, Anyways. So then they have the epilogue. What the hell happens to all these people? Like, they mentioned that Hera was actually in the Battle of Endor. I'm going to have to rewatch, like, the Super Mega Blu-ray edition and see if they added in the ghost in there somewhere, because that'd be kind of funny. Obviously, Rex was. We all knew that reference was there, right? People were making fun of that one for a while. What else did they mention? There's Kanan and Hera's kid, which is kind of awesome. I'm trying to think what else. There's a bit where the stormtroopers come out and the citizens are like, we're going to get you. Am I the only person who would just be absolutely ditching my stormtrooper armor as quickly as I could under those circumstances? Just nope. Oh yes, interesting little factoid. Palpatine is defeated first, then Thrawn, and then Price. Price is the very last one to be defeated. And for the longest time that bothered me. And I have to admit, a lot of that's because I think not just in terms of narrative, but in video game. In a video game, usually the last fight has to be something thematically significant. It's usually the main antagonist. Price is definitely not that, until you think about Price by a statement that I mentioned casually a few episodes ago, which I didn't realize how right I was. Price is everything wrong with the Empire. She insisted on dying, of her own accord, I might add, because, I will live and I will serve the Empire until the end. Her dying forms a nice thematic circle, in other words. It means that it's not the great evil that is defeated, because that's not going to happen until Return of the Jedi, or possibly Episode 9. It's not the worthy antagonist, the true enemy that is defeated, because he's off, he's just been removed, and we'll see exactly what happens in the future there. No, it is the very thematic core of the Galactic Empire that is defeated. The corruption, the stupidity, the short-sightedness, the cruelty, all those things that made the Galactic Empire just a rot, is all personified in Price. And so she dies, and she is the last one to go. So I'm with that. I don't know if that was on purpose, but I'd like to think it was. So then they skip forward 5 years. I like Callus realizing he didn't wipe out the people. That's a nice touch. I like to think that Callus would have cared a great deal about that. I already mentioned Hera and Jason. Of course, they called him Jason. Ahsoka and Sabine. That's an interesting one. So I mentioned that was the last we knew of Ahsoka, and I should have referended. I'm sure some of you guys are going to say in the comments about that. Ahsoka's here. But this is it. This is the furthest we know of Ahsoka. Going to find Ezra with Sabine. Interesting. And that's also post-Endor, which, as I just mentioned, isn't as covered as the other timelines, which is also interesting. And then it ends. I want to talk about the 3 big themes of Rebels before we go any further. Theme number 1, the one that really resonated with me the most, is... There's actually 4 themes, sorry. I'm looking at my notes here. That is accomplishing through cooperation, coordination, and teamwork what otherwise you could not. The final episode doesn't show this as well, but it still shows how, despite the overwhelming power of the Empire, it is fractured in purpose. Each of its various points are all going towards what they care about, not the actual benefit of the Empire as a whole. Whereas the disparate groups that make up the Rebel Alliance are far more unified in coalition, that they're actually genuinely working together, and they're the ones who succeed through their coordination, cooperation, and teamwork. There's also the theme of the symbiotic versus the forced. This is the idea of, this is functionally light side versus dark side, to be in tune with nature, like how Ezra so naturally connects with Sabine, or the wolves, or the Purrgil, versus what Thrawn does, which is just trying to force the situation, or Palpatine, who tries to manipulate the situation, trying to adjust it to what they think it should be, rather than trying to adapt to what it is. This also leads to the ideals of IDIC, how infinite diversity and infinite complexity. The idea of the uniform, virtually identical empire, which is ultimately floundering and helpless against the very diverse, very multi-species, multi-mentality, multi-perspective group that is the Rebel Alliance. The final one, the final theme, I think, is the most amusing. That's the theme of how hopeless it all is. I told you I'd bring it back up. Yeah. At multiple points in this episode, both Thrawn and Price repeat the idea, actually Palpatine does once too, repeat the idea of, there's no hope. There's no way you can stop me. This is the end. This is it. You've lost. And yet, consistently, they are shown to be wrong. Through long odds, courage, cunning, or Imperial stupidity, they manage to bring a victory out. In short, despite constantly verbally repeating that things are hopeless, the episode goes out of its way to show that things are not. That theme of hope. All four of these themes of the entire work of Star Wars Rebels are very strong within this final episode, and I think it was a nice cap to things. Overall, before I go into my final point, I just wanted to say, whoops, that I hit the wrong button there. I just wanted to say thank you, all of you, for allowing me to watch this show. This was a great show. I'll never have time to, but I hope to watch this show again sometime, just for fun, because I really liked this trip. Thank you, all of you. Now, I promised you I'd talk about the Force. I've decided after some thought, I'm going to make it a final video. One last companion video to this. So, I hope to see you there.